Hey everybody, Zach again, newtutorial.com, coming in making a video for you today. We're going to continue on with our Enoch series, and we're going to begin to dive into criticisms that I address of this book and talk about two big ones today that really deserve its own video. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about some of these criticisms. And the first one is that Enoch didn't write it. I have made the claim, it's my personal belief, that Enoch was in fact the author of the book of Enoch. And the way I'm going to lay out my argument here like I've laid out everything else and show you why I believe this is true. And so there are people who will come to me and the argument will be, Zach, we know Enoch didn't write this book. We know the book of Enoch had multiple authors. We know the book of Enoch had multiple authors. And I'll say, you're right. But newsflash, they're genius. So does the book of Isaiah, the book of Daniel, the Torah, the Psalms,
the psalmist,
and most other books of the Bible. They have what scholars today or people who specialize in this would claim have multiple authors. We're going to concentrate on the book of Isaiah. It's pretty widely known. If you've ever done any real research on the book of Isaiah, that the book of Isaiah has three different authors. The reason is because when you look at Isaiah, it's separated into three different sections, and the writing styles between each are vastly different. The writing styles of each are vastly different. So, if that's the case, we can make the claim, or someone today can make a claim, and probably rightfully so, that it was authored by three different people. Now, I believe the book of Isaiah was in fact authored by Isaiah. I believe that. So don't go crazy. Don't go, Zach's a heretic and he's... No, Isaiah was written by Isaiah. So how can I also claim it's probably a fact that it was written by three different people? Oral tradition. If you do not understand this fact, that most ancient texts were passed on originally by oral tradition, you're just not comprehending what is the real picture here. We know, for instance, the Epic of Gilgamesh. We have a tablet that's about 3000 BC that we know was before and after, what people believe before and after, was carried on through oral tradition. And it matches up a lot with what the clay tablet has inscribed upon it. The Iliad by Homer. People believe today that at least for 500 years, the Iliad was passed on and existed only in oral tradition for 500 years before it was canonized. I mean, brought on paper, written down, and the story, basically made, okay, here's the story, in its final written form. We know for 500 years it was passed through oral tradition. The Iliad, one of the most complex works of literature. I mean, have you ever read the Iliad? Have you ever watched any of the movies, a plethora of movies that portray this Homer author and his work? It's crazy. But it was passed down by oral tradition, but there's a lot to remember in the Iliad. Are you saying, Zach, that someone had to memorize the entire book of Isaiah? Yes. But if you look at the Iliad, that's not that big a deal. It's huge, just like Isaiah is huge. I think Isaiah had 66 chapters. But I mean, it's separated into three parts clearly. The Messiah quoted from each part, and each part he claimed as Isaiah. He didn't claim that this was written by such and such, or Isaiah 1, or Isaiah 2, or Isaiah 3. No, he said Isaiah. Isaiah was in fact the author of Isaiah, but what happens with oral tradition is someone, usually a scribe, would come to a village and take down a story. And the way stories were remembered back then were by different people, and everyone would participate. Can you imagine if tomorrow I took away your cell phones, your computers, your laptops, your radios, your TVs, and all of your books, and you became illiterate just like that? Something amazing would begin to happen. You would begin to talk again. You would begin to talk to other people. You would begin to orally, vocally disseminate information and share information. And your entertainment would only be about what would come out of here, and that's what would happen. Let's take a look at this quote from Aaron Hansen. It says, oral-based knowledge systems are predominant amongst First Nations. Stories are frequently told as evening family entertainment to pass along local or family knowledge. Stories are also told more formally in ceremonies such as potlatches to validate a person or family's authority, responsibilities, or prestige. Some stories are told only during certain seasons, at a particular time of day, or in specific places. In the same vein, some stories are meant to be heard only by specific people. Such stories often teach important lessons by a given society's culture, the land, and in the ways in which members are expected to interact, and each other and their environment. The passing on of these stories from generation to generation keeps the social order intact. As such, oral histories must be told carefully and accurately, often by a designated person who is recognized as holding this knowledge. This person is responsible for keeping the knowledge and eventually passing it on in order to preserve the historical record. And so that's how oral tradition works. It's someone who is entrusted with a portion or a story or a portion of a story, and then that person has to tell the story and be responsible for passing it down and repassing it down accurately. There's another group, the Aborigines of Australia. They have these things called song lines. And basically, the way the Aborigines would navigate across the landscape and find out where they were when they were traveling, either tracking game or doing other things, would be they go to village, and then they would pass on songs. And the songs would have characteristics of the song or attributes of the song that would tell the traveling Aborigine or Aborigines where they were and where next they needed to go to get to the point that they were trying to reach. It was maps. They were using and, sharing maps through songs orally, oral tradition. And this is well documented. Song lines. It's called song lines. And they would use these as maps. So it's not outside the realm of possibility that all of these we know this for a fact. We have, about the time of Ezra the scribe, most people, many Bible scholars, and I hate when people start throwing Bible scholars out at everybody. My Bible scholar says this. Well, chances are I can find another Bible scholar that says that and disagrees with your Bible scholar. So then we get into the war of the Bible scholars. It's insanity. But many Bible scholars believe that Ezra was in fact the author of many of the books of the Bible. He was the one who eventually wrote them down for dissemination, for spreading around, for copying amongst other scribes. And he existed about 400 BC, give or take. And then you had about 200 years later, the up-and-coming Ptolemy II, who really built the library at Alexandria. Ptolemy II was amazing in the fact that he was like, spare no expense. He sent scribes with bags filled with money out to the furthermost reaches of the known world to collect stories and whatever knowledge they could to bring it back and be gathered into a library or set of libraries, which really became the Library of Alexandria. And they just wanted information. Kings at his time were measuring themselves based on how much knowledge they possessed. How much knowledge you possess is going to determine how great of a king you are. And so he's like, spare no expense. I'll spend all my money and trying to find all of this knowledge, bring it into me, and we'll have it as a collection here at the library. And so, he went out to all these places. But when you go to all these places and everything exists by oral tradition, and a scribe shows up at your village where everyone is illiterate, you have three people who have a story they want to tell, and the scribe wants to write it, and he pays them for their money, or he's paying for his travel expenses to get there. And he writes the story, and first person comes up, he tells his side of the story. Second person comes up, he tells his side of the story. Third person comes up, he tells his side of the story. But the scribe writes it down the way the person's telling it. And so someone looking at this later on is like, sounds like this was written by three different people. Well, yeah, it was written by three different people who were telling the story to the scribe who was writing it down. That's how it works. Or it worked by having multiple scribes come and put together larger stories like in Iliad or Isaiah and put it together multiple ways because it was a lot of work for one scribe. So maybe there was three scribes attributed to the work of putting it all together. Either one could make it read to someone years later that, there's different people, who have put this together. Same with the book of Enoch. You cannot use the argument that we know Enoch was written by multiple authors. Of course it was. So was everything else in your Bible almost. The book of Daniel. Most people believe that there were 2 to 3 authors to the book of Daniel. You have the tales of the court. You have the apocalyptic stuff at the end. Clear break in writing styles between those two sections. And so some people say 2 authors. Some people say 3. But I still believe it was Daniel who was the author of it. Same with Enoch. Enoch is split up into different sections. And I still believe it was Enoch who authored it. That is the main argument. When you can't use that argument, for me, it's not valid. I'm sorry, it's just not. Now that I know what I know about oral tradition and all these other ancient works, they all read the same way. It looks like it was put together by different people. That's why you have Greek influence in the book of Enoch. It's Ptolemy II. We'll get to the age in a second here for the next criticism. But yeah, around 200 BC is the oldest copies of the book of Enoch that we have. And that's around the time of Ptolemy II. It's a Greek world. So anyone reciting the book of Enoch or copying it down is going to copy down the influences of the world they have around them. It's the same way in Matthew chapter 20. The guy who owns the vineyard or owns the field pays each person a pence, according to the King James. Now, if you're nobody from nobody and you don't know anything, and you go in, you pick up a copy of the King James Bible, and you turn to Matthew chapter 20, well, this must have been written by the British. It's pseudepigrapha. Because a pence is a denomination of value that only the British use. So you're going to incorrectly come to the conclusion that this is a British work. It's pseudepigrapha. It's not written by, Matthew or any other writer of New Testament 2,000 years ago. No, this was written, if you didn't know any better, because the author at the time the King James was written is using the influences, it's using the vernacular of the things around him during his day. So yeah, Enoch has Greek influence in it. People say, oh, well, see, that's why it shows you it's not that old. That's an insane argument. Insanity to use something that was prevalent in that day when the author wrote it down. Same way Matthew chapter 20 uses a pence, a British denominated money value. Oh, it's insanity. But let's move on to the second criticism. That's oral tradition. Now let's move over to the other criticism where people come to you and they say, Zach, this book, it's not that old. It only dates back to 2nd century BC. At the most, 2nd century BC. Again, newsflash there, genius. The oldest copy fragment that we have of the book of Genesis dates back to 2nd century BC. In fact, was found in the very same cave as the book of Enoch, right alongside it. The oldest copy fragment that we have of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, was found in the Qumran caves, the Dead Sea Scrolls, right alongside the book of Enoch. In fact, the book of Enoch was found in almost every single one of those caves. Copy fragments of the book of Enoch was found in almost every single one of those caves. So you can't use the argument that it's not old enough. The oldest copy of, in fact, the oldest copy fragments that we have of every book, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Genesis, the parts of the Torah were all found right alongside the book of Enoch. They're dated the same. In fact, copies that we have of the book of Enoch found at the Dead Sea Scrolls, according to the experts, date anywhere from 1st to 3rd century BC. Same as the oldest copies of all the other books that were found there. They're all dated at about the same time. Why? Because about the time of 2nd century BC, things started heavily to be written down by scribes. The time of Ptolemy II. He spared no expense. Go out there and make all the copies you can do, and I'll pay you whatever. Just bring them back to me. And there was formed the library at Alexandria. At one point, they say, housing close to 500,000 scrolls. 500,000 scrolls. Amazing. You can't use as an argument that we know it wasn't authored by Enoch because it had multiple authors. Most books of the Bible had multiple authors. You can't use it's not old enough because it dates back to the same age as all the other fragment copies that we have of the books of the Bible. Those are poor arguments. Very poor arguments. Stay tuned. We're not done yet. We have a lot more criticisms to go through. You're going to enjoy this. We're going to have a lot of fun. All right, go home. Read your Bible. Thanks.